we can think of. So if we start with Blinkhorn, and we can go through it together, I have some issues with the study in general. So perhaps if I raise one concern, then you can respond rather than me say the whole lot at once. How does that sound?
Yep.
Okay. Now I've put a couple graphs that I took from the data. Now they did cross-sectionally, they did multivariate analysis. Well, I suppose for the viewers I should describe a little bit about the study. They took 3 different areas in Australia, one of which was the town of Gosford, which was in 2008 commenced to fluoridate the water supply. The other town was Wyong, which is another Central Coast suburb, which is about roughly 20 kilometres or 15 to 20 kilometres north of Gosford. And Wyong had been fluoridated for the past 40 years. So those 2 suburbs of Central Coast, which is just north of Sydney, and then the areas that they chose to compare that were never fluoridated and not fluoridated were Ballina and Byron, which are somewhat, as they described in the study, more rural and less industrialised. And those 2 suburbs are roughly 500 kilometres right up at the top of New South Wales. So a slightly different climate, being 500 kilometres closer to the equator and more rural. As we can see in this graph here, I'll try and put it in without completely blotting Ken out of the picture. In this graph here, which I did from the data, and I should add that this data was adjusted according to confounders cross-sectionally. So each 2-year time period was somewhat adjusted according to the confounders that they looked at between those population groups that were analysed for, in this case, decayed, missing or filled teeth, nearly 6-year-old children. So this is the unadjusted, raw, crude data, and it does look a little bit different. So in the unadjusted data, you can see this at the top is the non-fluoridated. This one in the middle, that line, is the newly fluoridated town. And in this unadjusted data, the 2 start out pretty much the same, which was roughly, on average, a mean of 2 decayed, missing or filled teeth at the age of 6. And then the initial drop is quite great here in the newly fluoridated town for the first 2 years, from 208 to 210. While the drop in the Byron and Ballina areas that are not fluoridated was very minor here. And then from 2010 to 2012, the percentage drop of the fillings in the non-fluoridated areas was quite significant. Now, when we allowed for when we took into consideration the multivariate analysis, which looked at confounders such as, I've got a list of them here. Was the parent of the child a card holder, meaning were they of a lower income? Was their maternal country of birth English speaking or non-English speaking? Toothbrushing behaviour, did they brush more than twice or more a day or only once or less a day, and so on? Sugary drink consumption, did they have more than one sugary drink a day or no sugary drinks? And so on. So that's how they relatively adjusted cross-sectionally these figures here. So when they adjusted for those confounders, they found that the newly fluoridated area proportionately had a lower level of DMFT teeth than the rural non-fluoridated areas. So when you looked at those confounders, it did make somewhat of a different picture in terms of the results. So you can see there. So when you look at this is probably the most accurate graph we can look at, because they've adjusted as best they can to the variety of different confounders.
You're plotting the ratio there. There's table 5, is it?
Yeah, if you look at the ratio, say, of 2008 on table 3, this is all on from table 3. So table 3.
I don't think that
multivariate analysis of decayed, missing or filled teeth according to year fluoridation status, and socioeconomic characteristics. Table 3. And so if you look at the first fluoridation status, there's the three different statuses: fluoridated, newly fluoridated, unfluoridated. The fluoridated town, they've kept that as the referent, so that remains at 1. And then as adjusted according to confounders, they've found that the newly fluoridated at 2008 sample was 1.47 greater in terms of DMFT than the referent town. So that's how we get that point there, which is exactly 1.47 greater in terms of DMFT than that point there. Does that make sense, Ken?
Yeah.
So this is the adjusted data. And then up here we have the unfluoridated, which is 2.06 of the referent town down here. So if you measure from there to there, that's twice the distance. So when they've adjusted as best they could, which obviously is difficult in a situation where you only have a sample size of essentially 3, but the best they could manage to adjust for confounders had that result. So in terms of looking at the relative drops, this graph is the most useful, right?
Okay.
So when you look at this graph, you can see that all the towns had a relative drop. So all the regions, I should say, had a relative drop, and I would say quite rapidly and dramatically. I mean, the question is whether or not the samples were, whether or not these these dramatic drops are actually representative of the populations, or whether it's just random sampling error, which is quite possible because they picked 3 different populations at each point. Either way, they're quite dramatic. Would you not agree? They're quite dramatic drops that we're seeing, right? So my first concern is essentially that the change of DMFT rates was not constant. It was changing all over the place. And since these changes had, in these 2 towns, that is in the non-fluoridated and in the always fluoridated town, where there was no change in fluoridation status, in those 2 regions in which there was no change of fluoridation status, the decline in decayed, missing or filled teeth can have nothing to do with fluoridation status in those 2 regions, right? In terms of water fluoridation status.
No. In the unfluoridated areas, the change is not due to fluoridation, but
right.
The other 2.
Right. Okay, that's good to hear you agree on that point. So if the change in these 2 areas was not due to fluoridation, then
no, there's only one area.
Right, but I know that they're claiming that the change in this town was due to fluoridation, right? Because at this point it wasn't fluoridated, and then it was. So as time progressed, fillings went down, and so they're claiming that change in this town was due to fluoridation, right?
Yeah.
Okay, they can claim that, but what I'm getting at is that if the changes that occurred in these towns, and there's considerable changes in terms of percentage overall, this 40% drop is the same as this 40% drop. Between these 2 years is 40% drop. This is also 40% drop. So those changes are equally 40% drops, the major changes I'm talking about, and yet we know that this change was not due to fluoridation status. So my concern is to say that the decline in the newly fluoridated town could at least just as plausibly be explained not by fluoridation, but by the same unknown factors that caused the rapid declines in the other 2 towns.
Yeah, that figure you've got there doesn't correspond to to table 3, because the unfluoridated ratio goes up from 2.06 to 2.81.
Yeah, but these are relative ratios. That they're not saying that the ratio of the number of decayed, missing or filled teeth between 2010 was adjusted according to 2008. And that's what I'm trying to say here. That those figures, the adjustments were only done cross-sectionally, not
could you
not
explain
longitudinally.
what table that's coming from?
That's coming from Table 3.
Table 3?
Yeah, Table 3. But the thing I think you might be missing, Ken, is that the ratios, that is the 1, the 1.47, the 2.06, right? Those ratios apply to the actual measured decayed, missing or filling teeth per group, per area. So they've used the referent town, that is the always fluoridated town, which was fluoridated for 40 years. They've used that as the referent. And so that town, which is Wyong, is unadjusted in comparison to the others because they've just left that at 1, right? But the actual measurement of Wyong, right, is changing, right? So that 1 applies in 2008 to 1.4, and that's why it's here 1.4, and that 1 applies in 2010 to 0.96, and that 1 in 2012 applies to 0.69, and that's why that figure there is.
We're not looking at Table 3.
No, we're looking at Table 3 with Table 2 sitting right above it, right?
Yeah.
So Table 2 is the actual mean DMFT results of each town. Table 2 shows the actual results, so it says 1.4, 2.02, 2.09, and the Table 3 is the multivariate analysis cross-sectionally, and that multivariate analysis, those figures of 1, 1.47, 2.06, they apply directly to the means of each town as measured in decayed, missing or filled teeth. And that's how I created that graph. Right?
You haven't got...
Sorry? I didn't hear you, Ken.
haven't got that. You haven't got the corrected... what you've got for the corrected, after correction for all the other variables,
Yep.
you've got a ratio.
Yep.
The Table 2 has not been corrected.
No, Table 2 has not been corrected, no.
For data.
Table 2 is just pure crude data. Table 3 shows the ways that raw data would be corrected according to the confounders.
But no, it doesn't. That shows the result after correction, and then using the ratios, you don't know what would it come out of the statistical analysis, whether or not they did actual values or just work with the ratios, but you wouldn't know what they are.
No, they've.
I think that the key thing is what you're saying is you're saying two things. There's a clear difference, but there's also a difference over time. And the unfluoridated areas as well.
We may not agree on how they've done their data, but I do believe this is correct. But nevertheless, the point is that my main issue, or my first issue with the study, is that all 3 towns had a dramatic reduction. The never fluoridated had a 40% reduction from 2010 to 2012, and the newly fluoridated town also had a roughly 40% reduction from 2008 to 2010. So, and that's adjusted or not adjusted. That both works out to be around 40%. So, the always fluoridated town and the never fluoridated town both had substantial reductions. I mean, really substantial reductions. So, for neither the always fluoridated or the never fluoridated towns could these reductions have anything to do with fluoridation status, because they had no change in fluoridation status. So these.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Let me respond to that then.
Yeah, sure.
When you take the raw data, you see that there's obviously different effects going on, and so to separate out the effect due to fluoride from other effects, you've got to take the other variables into account, and they've done the best they could there.
Yeah, they have. Yeah.
And after doing that, there's still a clear difference.
In all three towns, yeah. Absolutely. And that's why...
Well, no, not in all three towns. The newly fluoridated town, which starts off with, being more similar to the unfluoridated areas, but it moves into becoming very close, what's significantly different to the fluoridated area.
And what I'm saying is that both the fluoridated, as we see again, I keep bringing that graph up, but as we see that the always fluoridated town also had substantial drops. And so likewise, yes, this newly fluoridated town had a, at this point roughly 25% greater percent drop at this point, and then slightly less here. But they both those two towns had significant drops as measured in those samples. And as I said, it could be that the samples were, they were random samples, and it wasn't a cohort, so there were a different set of people each time. So it could have been that they just, picked a different bunch of people. But they are significant. Likewise, hugely significant as compared to the newly fluoridated town. The unfluoridated group also had 40% reduction, especially from 2010 to 2012. So it seems to be presumptuous to claim that the reduction in the DMFT here, right, in the newly fluoridated town was due to the fluoride, when a more parsimonious conclusion may be to say that the unknown factors, we don't know what caused this, and we've tried to control for them as best we can, but the drop still happened, even when you controlled for as many confounders as they could think of. The unknown factors which caused this drop is likely to have also caused as much or possibly even all of the drop down here. Because we don't even know what these factors were. We don't know what the factors were here. We don't know what the factors were here. We've tried to account for them by looking at the confounders, such as the parent card holder, are they brushing well, are they drinking sugary drinks, and all of those confounders didn't account for that change. So we have to conclude that there's a huge level of uncertainty about what caused that drop. And if there's a certain certainty about what caused that drop and what caused that drop, then if you were to compare the three as three samples, so to speak, because each town is essentially one sample, because you're only looking at whether the fluoridation status was on or off or just turned on. So it's not on an individual level of each individual within the sample. You're looking at the group as a whole, right? Is this group as a whole unfluoridated? Is this group as a whole fluoridated? So you've really only got three samples in that sense. And to then state that we don't know what caused that, we don't know what caused that, but we must know what caused that, is disingenuous.